As long as we've had correctional systems, we have been making risk assessment decisions. It's just the methods that we've used to make those decisions have changed over time.
I'm here with Grant Duwe, who is Academic Advisor for Criminal Justice Reform here at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also the Director of Research for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. And he's here to talk today about two new papers that he has, one on automated risk assessments and a second paper on how we can better time and dose and sequence services for individuals who are getting ready to return from prison. So why don't you just begin by walking us through a little bit of the paper on timing, dosage, and sequencing. And let's start there. You begin that paper by talking about risk needs responsivity principles. So you need to explain what that is for our audience, and then why it's so important.
Sure. The risk needs responsivity model, or what's known as the R&R model within corrections, that emerged in the early 1990s. And this is a model that guides the delivery of correctional programming. It's a model that has been embraced by correctional agencies throughout North America and to some extent internationally. And the model tells us who, what, and how we should be delivering correctional programming. The risk principle tells us that we should try to target the programming resources we have on the higher risk individuals. The needs principle tells us what areas we should try to target for programming. For example, criminogenic needs such as criminal thinking, substance abuse, education, employment, these are all areas that we try to target for programming. And then the responsivity principle tells us how we should be delivering programming, that we should try to cater it to the learning styles, strengths, and abilities of the correctional population.
I see. Okay, good. Thanks for that, that explanation of the overview. Your paper points out that most of our programming focus should be on prisoners with a high risk of recidivism. Why don't you tell us why that is? Why do we want to focus on those individuals who are at the highest risk?
The main reason why we want to focus on those who are, well, a couple reasons why we want to focus on those who are higher risk. One is that individuals who are lower risk, the evidence suggests that if we provide them with programming or too much programming, it can actually make outcomes worse. But
Can I interrupt you there and just ask why do we think that is? Why does helping too much end up hurting?
Well, to some extent, it goes back to the fact that if someone is in an intervention with other higher risk individuals, that it can have a negative effect on this person, and by introducing them to antisocial peers who are more embedded in a criminal lifestyle, that it can potentially make them worse. But for those people who are higher risk, we want to concentrate more of the programming resources that we have, because the evidence suggests that for someone who's higher risk, that they need a higher dosage of programming in order to desist from crime or to stop committing new crimes.
So talk a little bit about when's the right time to be working with someone who is incarcerated. There's kind of a division, I think, of opinion as to whether you start when they first come in, whether you wait until they're closer to release in order to really ramp up and intensify the types of services and the number of services that they're receiving. So tell us about that. What is that?
I think the evidence suggests that it's not just a timing issue, but it's a dosage issue. And I think the literature indicates that ideally we should be providing programming throughout one's stay in prison, because we generally see better outcomes when individuals are participating in programming it reduces their risk of misconduct, but it also leads to better outcomes like employment and less recidivism after someone gets released. And even the reentry literature indicates that reentry should start as soon as someone comes into prison. And I think the evidence is largely supportive of that. But what we do see are that programming resources are usually pretty limited. And because those resources are limited, there are times where individuals don't participate in any programming, in which case we're warehousing those individuals. Warehousing leads to worse recidivism and employment outcomes. But then there are also some individuals who are able to participate in maybe just one intervention. And the evidence on timing suggests that if someone can just do one intervention, then we should try to backload programming in order to get the best recidivism outcomes. If, however, we're more interested perhaps in reducing prison misconduct, then maybe we should try to front load programming.
So are there any specific kinds of activities or services that seem to be more effective than others in terms of getting those good outcomes once people are released?
To some extent, it does depend on what a person's needs assessment indicates, because it varies across individuals. But what we see in general are fairly good outcomes for interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, substance abuse treatment, sex offender treatment, education programming, some types of employment programming. We do see some good outcomes for those types of interventions.
And can you talk a little bit about what CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy actually is?
It's an intervention that's designed to address the thinking patterns that someone has, and that we can introduce changes in someone's behavior by adjusting the way that they think about certain situations or circumstances.
So people they've developed habits of thinking and approaching the world and responding to other people, and CBT helps them to learn a new way of responding to challenges.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's shift now to the risk assessment. I know you've done a lot of work in this area, thinking about better ways, more efficient ways, and more effective ways of assessing risk. So walk us through a little bit of the history of risk assessments, and then you're thinking about how we might want to think differently about how to do them.
Sure. Well, before the 1970s, well, as long as we've had correctional systems, we have been making risk assessment decisions. It's just the methods that we've used to make those decisions have changed over time. But before the 1970s, we relied mostly on professional or clinical judgment or gut instinct in making risk assessment decisions. But in the 1970s, we begin to see the emergence of actuarial assessments, or assessments that are based on statistical methods in making predictions about what someone's going to do in the future. And the literature has consistently shown that actuarial or statistical judgment outperforms professional or clinical judgment.
So our guts are not always right.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And this is true not just for corrections, but in a variety of disciplines. And this was first shown in the 1950s and has continued up through the present day. But as we see the emergence of the risk needs responsivity model in the 1990s, we transitioned from the first generation, which relied on professional judgment, to the second generation, which relied on actuarial assessments that looked mostly at static factors. With third generation assessments, we're looking at static factors, but also dynamic factors. We're looking at risk factors in which changes can take place, like someone's substance abuse. That's a risk factor for recidivism. If we address that risk factor through programming, then we can potentially mitigate risk for that person. And then for fourth generation assessments, we see the focus on risk and needs, but we also see a greater focus on protective factors, those things that can reduce risk, in addition to making sure that someone receives multiple assessments from the time they come into the system to the time that they leave. and what we've seen, especially with the third and fourth generation assessments, is that there have been a number of concerns with the way that they performed. But I will say that even with the concerns that we see with third and fourth generation assessments, that they're still much better than staff having to rely on their gut instincts in making decisions.
Right, right. So tell us about what an automated risk assessment is.
Before I answer that, I think it's important for everyone to know that that the vast majority of assessments that are performed on correctional populations are accomplished through a manual process.
And what do you mean by a manual process?
In which a correctional staff person either conducts a one-on-one interview with the person on their caseload, whether a probationer or a prisoner, or they do a manual assessment in which they conduct a database review. But the idea here, though, is that the staff person is entering the values on this assessment themselves in order to generate the risk assessment output. And the work that I've done indicates that if we take this process, which has been manual for most assessments, and we automate it, then it produced a number of benefits, including a very healthy return on investment.
So what does an automated process look like then? It's not somebody sitting in front of a computer, it's something else. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Right, and well, one thing that is important to understand is that a lot of the information that goes into a risk assessment instrument consists of data that already exists within the system. And so the automated process that we have used simply takes a lot of that data and it pulls it into the assessment, and it's a much more efficient and cost-effective way of doing the assessment.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get to the efficiency question, but I want to first be really clear about we hear a lot about artificial intelligence, a lot about machine learning, a lot about computers taking on some of these tasks of analysis that human beings have done in the past. So is this artificial intelligence? Is it something else?
Yeah, it could be. Using an automated approach could lend itself to artificial intelligence and the use of machine learning algorithms. But automation simply refers to the scoring method, or the method by which the items on an assessment, that those values are populated. And that's a much more efficient way of doing the scoring method. But it does make it much easier to use machine learning algorithms and AI in order to make risk assessment decisions for correctional populations, but those are not necessary components for automation.
Okay, so in this instance, what you're really talking about at this stage is you have an automated process for looking at the data, but a human being is still looking at what that data says and deciding what it means, and then this is how we're going to apply the data. Okay, that's helpful to know.
And it's still, and the automated process can be as transparent as a correctional agency would like it to be.
You mentioned this briefly, but I'd like to just expand on it a little bit, which is, how is it that what the machine does in terms of putting this data together different than what our gut tells us when we're interviewing somebody, encountering them, and why is it better?
Because we have a lot of cognitive biases when we're making risk assessment decisions or trying to predict how someone is going to behave in the future. One of the examples that I've mentioned previously is when we make risk assessment decisions, we sometimes import factors into our decision-making process that ultimately don't help us make accurate predictions. An algorithm, on the other hand, if it's an actuarial algorithm that has been trained and tested on the data and has demonstrated good performance, it considers only those things that truly have an impact on the outcome that you're trying to predict. And because of that, there's consistency in what the algorithm includes and how it performs, and we on the whole, we see better predictive performance.
So this is my last question. I mean, you helped oversee research in a large correctional system in the state of Minnesota. You know kind of what the costs are that are associated with the way that we're currently doing assessments and what we might be able to save by moving to an automated process. So talk a little bit about that. What does the data show in terms of efficiency and really making sure that we get the right help to both the right people and a larger number of people?
Right. Well, the manual process that a lot of correctional systems use, it's very unwieldy, it's very time-consuming, such that there are a lot of individuals in correctional systems who either don't get evaluated or who don't get assessed, or if they do get assessed, they don't get the full assessment. And what automation does is that it makes it possible to do the full risk needs responsivity assessment for individuals who are in the system. Because if we were to do that manually, then it would be very time consuming. The research that we've done in Minnesota suggests that by automating some of the assessment process, that there's been a fairly large return on investment. And much of that investment is through staff hours saved. Because if we had used a manual process to complete the assessments that we have through the automated process, it would have cost millions of dollars.
Grant, thank you so much for your time here today. I know our audience is looking forward to reading your reports. I know that you'll be getting some comments from them, and we really appreciate your service here at AEI and the community at large. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brent. It was a pleasure.
Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Grant Duwe. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, remember to like the video or leave us a comment. And be sure to check out the rest of our videos and research from AEI.